So let's get started. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Jochen, for inviting me. This is a community that I used to mix with a lot, but have kind of, as Jochen mentioned, moved more into developmental sciences and some applied education work, which I'll tell you about in a little while. In fact, I was at ICDL in Prague only a few weeks ago, and it reminded me how much I really enjoyed this kind of mixing of computational modeling and experimental psychological work. As Jochen said, I started out by studying physics. In fact, the truth is I wanted to be a primary school teacher when I finished high school, but I was good at maths and people said, oh my God, don't waste your time being a primary school teacher, do something else, which I think is a terrible thing to say. And very quickly within my undergraduate degree, I realized that children were a lot more interesting than rocks, and kind of tried very hard to move back into studying kind of children development, but bringing with me this kind of mechanistic idea that comes out of the physical and natural sciences, trying to understand things in terms of causes. And as you'll see, if I managed to cram in all my slides, my career has made a full turn, and I now live my fantasy of being a primary school teacher by working in schools. So it took me 25 years, but I got there. Anyway, so this title, grandiose title, The Challenge and Reward of Pursuing Real-World Developmental Science. And that immediately raises the question of, oops, what do we mean by real world? And those of you who were young in the US in the 90s might know that there was a reality TV program on MTV called The Real World, where they selected some random people and filmed them 24 hours a day. And they had one episode in London. And it turns out that one of the 6 or 7 people here was someone who shared my office as a PhD student. He took a break from academia to go into the real world, as it were. And this raises the question of which of the two were the real worlds. But of course, this is not about this MTV reality TV program. It's more about trying to understand how learning and development happen outside the lab. And there are people who saw this title might think that I'm going to go into the kind of big data and kind of looking at the naturalistic statistics in the child's environment. And indeed, that's a huge area of work where the kind of new technologies that have been developed in the last 5 to 10 years have really been used effectively to identify what the effective learning environment of the child is. And I've just named a few people here who have been kind of seminal in pushing this field forward, but there are lots of other people. I'm not really going to talk about big data. I'm going to talk about other considerations we need to keep in mind when considering developments and things that we often forget as researchers. The only thing I want to say about the kind of big data aspect of it is that, to my mind, the kind of new technologies that we use to process the data are not necessarily good models of how learning happens during childhood. In particular, mistakes that researchers often make is to assume that something like a large language model might explain how learning takes place in the child, and forget that children don't have, 20 million words from the New York Times to access with. Or similarly, if you're going to use a kind of convolutional type network where you've labeled the categories at the end, this has an underlying assumption that the world comes labeled, which of course it doesn't, right? So we have to find ways, mechanisms that allow us to build up the complex behaviors that we observe in even babies, toddlers, children, and adults, and so forth, without relying on massive data to start with, and without relying on labeled information. So that's my little caveat. In fact, what I'm going to talk about are some general principles that really need to be kept in mind when studying child development. So to do that, I'm going to step through 4 or 5 quick parts. I've, as usual, crammed too much information in too little time, so I'm going to try to go quite quickly through some of these things. First, I will kind of present very quickly a kind of a theoretical framework that we've used to guide our research here at the center. And then I'll give an example of functional systems working together. And here, this will be a modeling example, neural network modeling. And then we'll talk about sensory integration and how actually taking into consideration the growing body is important for understanding why kids can combine certain sources of perceptual sensory information and not others. We'll talk about what happens in the kids' brains when they work together. So the brain is not actually working in isolation. It's in the context of other individuals. And my fourth part, usually I run out of time, but I'm going to do it anyway, is the challenge of taking this, when I say the real world, of taking this kind of basic science and translating it and working with people who have completely different objectives and criteria to translate it into something that will impact on the real world. So, little rush through this. The Neuroconstructivist framework. This is a framework that I developed with some other colleagues that were at the Center for Brain and Cognitive Development almost 20 years ago. And without going through the whole larva of what it's about, I think to give you a flavor for what it's about, the starting point is kind of Marr's idea of independent levels of representation, and that in cognition, that these levels can be studied completely independently. And our position is that that's completely wrong. Right. So nope, that you can't study the functional computational level without understanding something about the representation and the algorithmic level or the hardware level, because if you don't know anything about the algorithm or the hardware, you don't understand why the system falls apart along certain fault lines or how it can possibly grow as well. So on the basis of this, we kind of sketched out a framework that had some critical factors. And the neuroconstructive framework, I think the critical piece of information is that development is context dependent. So at all levels of representation, we find that functional systems organize according to what is happening around them. So this happens even at the level of the cell. Functional neural systems, neurons develop the functional specialization in the context of cellular activity around them, of other neighboring cells. It happens in the context of, sorry, I'm trying to, get rid of a window. Functional brain systems, in the sense that, functional systems are not isolated modules, but they interact with other systems and share out the kind of responsibility for tasks that need to be computed. Embodiment, the idea that the brain is not disembodied. We are, in fact, we exist within a physical world, and that body shapes the experiences we have and how we can interact with the world. And of course, in socialment, we're not in isolation. We live within a social environment, and that society provides a scaffolding for the kinds of problems and experiences that we will encounter and are expected to be able to solve, what is valued and not valued, and so forth. So some of the key principles in the interactive specialization in the neuroconstructivist framework are the ideas of interactive specialization that had already been put forward by Mark Johnson. This is functional systems co-constraining themselves. The idea that there's a continuum of states across development. Where you are now in your developmental trajectory depends on where you came from beforehand, and is not necessarily a predictor of where you will be going in the future. The idea of partial or fragmented representations. As we develop, as we acquire more knowledge, more skills, each new skill builds on and uses some of the pre-existing work. So for example, if you're going to learn the concept of tiger, you don't need to learn a completely new concept of tiger. You just need to learn that tiny bit that makes a tiger separate from other cats, and then combine the two together. And as a consequence of this, the more experienced we become, the more the knowledge, the skills, representations are distributed across multiple areas and domains and functional systems. And finally, active learning is critical. Kids are not just couch potatoes. They are engaged in co-constructing and constructing their own knowledge. Causal understanding can really only be achieved through doing, through interacting with the world and observing the consequences. So these are the key kind of themes that run through neuroconstructivism. And I'm going to go through various sections that illustrate some of these themes in different types of work. So the first thing I want to illustrate is the need to consider functional neural systems working together here. And here I'm going to talk about some neural network modeling done with an amazing former PhD student of mine, Sam Blakeman, who's now at Sony AI. And this isn't really developmental, but it's something I really like. And it illustrates one of the principles. So I thought I would talk about it to this audience. So AI, new deep neural networks and so forth have hit the scene since 2015, 2016, and they're very effective at end-to-end tasks. But it's very difficult to ask questions about how the neural network solved a particular problem. One of the reasons is because the decisions are distributed across millions of micro decisions associated with each of the kind of parameter weights in the network. So we need to think about generating explanations from these kind of distributed representations. And one thing that might help is to think about how we generate explanations for our own actions. Okay, so if we think about it, what do we want from an explanation? This is one of my favorite cartoons. You're in the middle of the philosophy department and you're being told, here I am, right? And you can, from this map, you can know how to get there, but you're not answering the question of why am I here? And this makes a distinction between the kind of how and the why types of explanations. So how explanations are explanations about the sequence of steps that led to the particular state that you're in, the state of the world. The why is about causal explanations. And why explanations are far more complicated because they require not just a causal model of the world, but a causal model of the interlocutor, a causal model of what the person you're speaking to understands and what level of explanation they're requiring from a query. That's very, very hard. And I would suggest that most of the explanations we give in the world are actually how rather than why. They're about actions and interactions. If I'm asked, wow, how did you make that cake? The person doesn't want to know anything about the physics of rising agents and the chemistry of rising agents. They want to know about the steps taken to make this cake. So we're going to look at generating a sequence of action explanations from these distributed deep neural networks. And one thing we can do is to look at what happens in the brain. Of course, there are lots of different multiple functional systems in the brain, and in terms of memory and knowledge, a key dissociation that's been discussed many times before is the kind of dual systems hypothesis, the idea that you have a slow learning cortical representation and a fast kind of hippocampal, fast learning, one-shot learning hippocampal system that stores, for example, episodic memories. So episodic memories being memories of my personal experience. And that these two systems work together and in tandem to kind of explain learning in humans. On the side of this is the idea of what episodic memories might be for. So why do we need to remember certain instances, specific instances about what we've done with our lives? And a particular theory put forward by Maurer and Zebra is that actually episodic memories evolved out of the need to communicate with our conspecifics certain goals. So how to obtain certain goals. So imagine that we are tribal sort of people and we have suddenly discovered a mile and a half away a fantastic fishing area, okay? And we want to communicate to the rest of the population how to get to this fishing area. And what we do is then relive, replay the way in which we walked to that fishing hole in order to kind of communicate the key decision points to the conspecifics. And so this is what we're going to build on. And the other piece of evidence that we're going to build on is some work looking at one of the things that kind of switches or shifts between the one-shot learning versus gradual learning in the brain is kind of reward prediction errors. So if suddenly you encounter an instance in which the reward is very different from what you expected, then you encode that as an episodic memory for future processing, perhaps during consolidation at night or whatever. If it's as predictable, then you don't really encode it through an episodic memory. So using this distinction, Sam Blakeman and I came up with a kind of dual system complementary learning approach to temporal difference learning. And I'm going to skip through this because this isn't a neural network talk, but I'm going to illustrate how we can get explanations from this. So the idea in this network is that we had a deep convolutional network that was, a DQN, a DQ learning network that was paired with a much smaller episodic memory, a self-organizing map with about 25 different nodes in it. And effectively, this system was learning to solve, I'll show you some problems, but the map was identifying key states in the state space where the deep network was struggling to get the right answer, to carry out the right action. And it would encode, oh, look, this is a difficult point, and this is a point where I will store exactly what the optimal action is at that point. And so when you're interacting with learning this task, the system generally relies on the deep neural network pathway, but when it encounters that tricky position, it then retrieves from the self-organizing map, the episodic memory, what action optimal action it should actually be doing and ignores what the deep network is doing. And just very rapidly, just to show you some graphs to give you a sense of the different types of tasks we had. We had maze tasks, we had continuous control problems, ours is the contrastive temporal difference learning model, the blue line. And the only thing to take away from this is that the blue line is higher than the red line, which is we're better than the other people we were comparing ourselves for. So that's fine. That's kind of in the neural networks paper that you can go and read and so on. But the interesting thing is once you've got a trained system, you can replay the problem and read off in time which nodes in the episodic memory light up and what action. So what you get is a series of actions at specific positions in the state space. And those are hints, are clues, or instructions as to what to do at key moments in the problem where the deep neural network was struggling. So you might get a series of actions like the one on the left, agent 8, up, left, up, right, up, etc., or continuous movement things. So what we've done is we've kind of condensed the critical elements in the action sequences to those that are really important to get right and stored those in a kind of self-organizing map that can be read off. And indeed, you can read those off, you get a series of actions, and then you can use that as hints or suggestions to inform either naive humans or to pass on to another agent, another artificial agent, and vice versa. And what we did is test whether humans who were learning to solve these particular tasks, these mazes, how well they did. And they did better with the hints provided by the neural network. So they were the core information was being transferred to the humans, and vice versa. We got humans to solve this task, identify some hints that we then passed on to the deep network through the self-organizing map, and the networks then did better than a naive network and so forth. So it's not just the hippocampal side is not just a hack, a lookup sheet for how to get around those problems the deep network was struggling with. It's also a means for communicating between agents the critical information that is embodied or embedded within the larger deep network. So the key point to take away from this, in terms of the kind of the big picture of what I was saying, is to just remember that evolution has leveraged existing systems for multiple purposes, and that cognition emerges from multiple interacting systems. So not one system, but multiple systems processing the same information with slightly different objectives. And even very simple behavior. So we had a model with Sylvain Sirois a long time ago, simply modeling habituation, eye movements and habituation. And even simple behaviors like that are really the outcome of the interaction of different systems pulling or vying for control of the system in different directions. And so, studying what this says is that studying the functional systems in isolation, I'm being extreme, is not informative, but it's not as informative as studying those functional systems as they interact with each other. So, part one. Part two, I want to talk about some work I did with another fantastic postdoc of mine in this case, Marco Nardini, who is now professor at Durham and has been for a number of years. And this work is largely Marco's work. He came to me and said, look, I've got this great idea for a project we should be doing. Let's write a grant. He wrote most of the grant. I helped shape it, and we got the money, and we did some fantastic work. So he gets full credit for this. And the idea here was to look at the development of optimal cue combination across development. So it turns out that, of course, we live in a multisensory world, something people sometimes forget, and the cues, the sensory cues that we get don't all have equal reliability, equal information content and so forth. And you might think that the optimal thing to do would be to select the one cue which is the most reliable. But it turns out that actually we can be better than the best cue by still bringing in a little bit of information from those less reliable cues, combining as much information from all the cues, but weighting the cue information by the reliability of that cue, namely weighting it by the inverse of the variability in the cue. So this is Bayes' optimal cue integration. And there's evidence that adults use this in lots of different domains. And so we were exploring the extent to which children did Bayes' optimal cue integration. Now, Marco had already shown, and Monica Gori had already shown, that it wasn't until surprisingly 11, 12 years of age that kids seemed to do this optimal cue integration. So here we were asking about cue integration within a single sensory modality. So rather than across multiple sensory modalities. And so we focused on depth cues. There are lots of different depth cues. In particular, there's binocular disparity that can be used to predict depth, but also monocular cues like texture gradients. And so we developed a task in which the children had access to either monocular cues only, binocular only, or both, and had to make judgments about which path. So you can just about see this, I think, over here. I don't know if you can see my mouse. You can just about see it. Yeah, you can just about see it. The screen, the kids were wearing 3D goggles, and they had two different rectangles that were different inclinations, and the children had to say which road was the most difficult to walk on or to climb up. Oops, well, that was weird. So there was a lion and a dinosaur to make it all interesting. And of course, if you ever work with kids, you feed them stickers every 10 trials, and they'll just keep going forever. So they got stickers, they had 3D video games, they didn't want to come away from us. So they were making judgments about which was the steepest. They had three different conditions, and the optimal cue integration theory would suggest that they would be better than the best cue when they had both of them. And just to look at the results very quickly, if we look at the adults, that's exactly what we find with the adults. The adults, in the condition where they had both disparity and texture cue, outperformed any of the single cue conditions, and they matched the normative optimal model prediction as well. And this was true by 12 years, but by 10, 8, and 6, they weren't really doing this optimal cue integration stuff. So yeah, I'll skip the bottom thing, which is about reweighting, but the story here is that kids can actually select which cue to pay more attention to online dynamically, depending on the reliability of the cue in the same way as adults can, but not below 10. Now, if they're not actually fusing these cues automatically as adults do, then there might be conditions in which the kids can do better than the adults. And that's if some of the cues are competing or in opposite directions. So we reran this study with the original three conditions: texture, disparity, texture only. But also a condition in which texture and disparity were made opposite predictions. So here, this was the same different type task where you had the two slopes again, and the question was, is the slope on the right the same as on the left? And when texture and disparity are in conflict, as is the case here, if the participants are just averaging the information from the two of them, then they get a kind of average percept, which is actually the same as the slope on the left. So they don't differentiate anything. If, on the other hand, they're not averaging the cues, if they're able to access either disparity or texture independently, then they should be able to notice that this bizarre stimulus is somehow different from the one on the left. And this is exactly what we found. With adults, the first three columns are that we're measuring D prime here. The first three columns are exactly what we had before. And most importantly, when texture and disparity are in conflict, adult accuracy or detection performance is very poor. Because they are actually fusing the two cues together and then comparing it to the standard, and it's not making any sense at all. In contrast, the children who are not fusing the two cues in this conflict situation are able to make accurate judgments, or more accurate judgments certainly than adults, of the same difference of the slopes and so forth. So not fusing the cues does convey some advantage, but it raises the question of why. Why don't you just integrate them if it's automatically, if it's possible? And one possible reason is that it's really not a good idea to fuse, to fix these cues in, if the cues are not well calibrated with distance in the world, which might be the case in a kind of growing physical body. So if you think about disparity cues, I'm exaggerating here, but as the head gets bigger, the eyes move apart, so that the impact of the prediction of a particular angle for depth is changing. Similarly, we had a study like this where we were looking at vision and proprioceptive cues. So people had to touch their fingers together, eyes closed, and so forth. And we found that there were certain periods, this was a kind of non-linear pattern of performance. There were certain ages where kids appeared to have optimal cue, proprioceptive and visual cue integration, and others when they didn't. And the periods when they didn't were ages where we might expect in the population kind of growth spurts. So around 11, it all fell apart again. But that's because the arms are stretching out again, and your proprioceptive information is not as accurate anymore, and so you want to disentangle it. So this kind of pattern of when you have optimal cue integration can be understood in the context of the physical growth of the body. So, oh yes, the third experiment is also to ask, well, in the previous studies, we've been talking about optimal cue integration, but optimal in terms of accuracy. But perhaps what kids are doing is optimizing, but not, and maybe they're using Bayes optimal mechanisms, but maybe not as accuracy or with accuracy as the goal. Maybe they're optimizing for something like speed or reward instead. After all, we have to remember that we're interacting. We don't just have physical bodies that grow, but we're interacting in a dynamic world that is moving ahead at speed. And there's plenty of studies showing that actually information processing in children is slower than adults. So that your CPU is slower. So if your CPU is slower, you want to perhaps optimize for speed of response rather than accuracy of response, because especially in sensory motor tasks, if your timing is wrong, you end up with things like this, face first in the ground or falling off your bike. So maybe not having exactly the right location of the base is the right thing, but rather having the right timing of the placement of your foot and so forth is more important. So we reran the same kind of depth cue integration work, but here we had speeded response type trials, same, different, do as well as you can and so forth, and but as quickly as you can. And basically what we found is with adults, we replicated the finding that with 2 cues over some range of values, they're better than single cues, optimal Bayes integration. And with adults, their reaction times basically followed the quickest cue, processing cue. And with the 6-year-olds, we found that when they had 2 cues, it was somewhere in between each of the 2 cues, suggesting they're averaging or they're switching between them or some mixture of it. But for the children, when they had the 2 cues, at least in some conditions, their speed was significantly better than the fastest single cue. So it did look like they were somehow combining information, timing information from the multiple cues to optimize for speed rather than response. So the conclusion to take from that within the big picture of the neuroconstructivism is that perceptual cue integration is constrained by embodied need to kind of continuously adapt to the constraints of a rapidly changing body. I know many people talk about this embodiment element, but few people actually take it seriously. And also the need to act in real time in a dynamic, rapidly evolving world, which has consequences, i.e. falling over if you don't take some response in time. And as a cautionary note, I'm not a huge fan of the term optimal. But if you're going to use the term optimal, in the developmental context, I'd ask you to keep in mind the idea that what is adult optimal may not be the same as what is child optimal, and that itself changes through development. Okay, so a little kind of pregnant pause as I have a sip of water. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some work we're doing right now in the new research lab, the toddler lab that we've just had built. And this is some work that's looking at collaboration within preschoolers, and in particular, what is going on in the brain of preschoolers that are working together. So it's looking at the emergence of neural synchrony in collaborating preschoolers. And this is a project that's co-led by Paolo Pinti and Victoria Sinclair. And we've had a first paper out just this year. If people want to see what I'm going to be talking about here is actually some of the contents of that first paper. So collaboration is something that really emerges in preschool between 3 and 5 years of age. Particularly, kids go from this kind of parallel play to playing together. If you give 3-year-olds little Lego bricks and ask them to build a house, and you can tell them to do it together, they don't do it together, they still do it, build their own little houses. And in fact, in the lab, it's quite funny. We have some footage of children who, we tell them to work together to build a Lego house, and they kind of reluctantly do it. But as soon as they think we're not looking, they start building their own little house, right? Because they really don't want to be doing this. But by 5 or 6, they can kind of work together. And what we know about collaboration is it develops during the preschool years. It involves interacting with others, and it's influenced very much by the interactive context. So it's exactly the kind of task that we really need to be studying in kind of real world situations rather than kind of artificial, highly constrained lab-based situations. So what we did is build on some work that came out of Sabine Huhl's lab in Vienna, in which they had looked at neural synchrony between a mother and child who were working collaboratively together to build these kind of 10-gram puzzles. So basically, kids are getting a template like this, build a goose and some shapes, and they have to put it together in a shape like that. And there had already been some work looking at neural synchrony in mothers and babies in word learning, and so they extended this to problem solving. And so this is the basis of what we will be using, the method we'll be using, but looking at this collaborative problem solving in kids. In addition, we recorded a lot of overt behaviors, such as gaze direction, using motion tracking as well to kind of measure possible synchronous movement and so forth, to try to identify what might be the triggers in the environment of this kind of neural synchrony. There are hypotheses that it's something like joint eye gaze that triggers it and so forth. Whatever it is, it's not magic and it's not ESP, okay? But we don't fully understand what it is. So in the past, there have been a number of studies, particularly with adults, looking at neural synchrony during various types of problem-solving tasks. So there's some tasks down here at the bottom, but people have generally looked at synchrony between analogous brain regions. And here we'll be looking not just at analogous brain regions, but really looking at synchrony that occurs between different brain regions in the different agents, suggesting that maybe the different agents are approaching the same task, but approaching it in different ways and engaging different functional systems in their brain. And we'll this is a gratuitous picture of our lab. What I'm going to talk about is the first study where we had 49 dyads of 4 to 6 year olds and their mothers. We used functional near-infrared spectroscopy. When people talk about neural synchrony, they often confound different modalities. So you have studies that use EEG, some use fNIRS, some use fMRI, and actually these modalities are all looking at synchrony in very different frequency bands. So and I mean very different frequency bands. So probably reflecting very different processes, but in reviews they get lumped together. So we were using a wearable fNIRS system, which allowed us that the child has a kind of like swimming cap, neutron cap with some optodes in it, and this is connected to a power pack which they wear in a little battery bag here. And so this allows us to get kids to kind of move around and interact naturally, and we can record brain activity during their interactions with other children. So this is one in our virtual reality environment. This is our preschool lab where we have a whole room set up as a preschool, and it enables us to have 8, 10 kids together, and we can be studying them together. And as I said, this is a gratuitous picture of our new toddler lab. We have a new purpose-built lab with 5 floors, and each floor is designed to be a different context, like a school, a front room, a bedroom, virtual reality, and so on. So we're using fNIRS. I'm not going to explain fNIRS but basic idea is that near-infrared light is shown through the skull, and the amount that's refracted back is measured. And if you choose your wavelength appropriately, it's a wavelength that gets absorbed by hemoglobin, and therefore if there's a drop in the amount that's been detected as refracted back, you make the assumption that it was absorbed by hemoglobin. So it's a measure of the bold signal, basically. And this is just very quickly the kind of setup of our task. They were doing 10-gram puzzles, and these task blocks were interspersed with rest periods, and they were the children either completed it in full collaboration with their child here and mother there, or with a curtain in between it so that they couldn't see each other at all. Oops, so they couldn't see each other at all. Or we were trying to test the hypothesis of whether eye gaze was the driver of synchrony. The curtain would be partially lowered so that they couldn't see each other's faces, but they could still interact. And here's a video I'm not going to show you of a mum and a child working with each other. And this is stepped through very rapidly some technical detail. This is just for the nerds out there to instantly see what's going on. But basically, we use wavelet transform coherence as a measure of coherence. As the experiment goes on, we're measuring the time sequence of their optode signals. And we use wavelet transform to find coherence between the optodes and various parts of the mother and child brain, and we do this at different windows of frequency and periodicity. And here, what we did is just take straight out of the existing work. A little bit more technical detail. This is the cap for those that are interested. The most important thing is we were recording frontal and TPJ, but importantly, we had short as well as long separation channels. So what you might have been able to see in my figure F nears is that there's a kind of banana of light. So light shines in and refracts back out. The closer together you put the optode and the receiver, the shallower you get of measurements. So by having short separation channels, you can record vascular changes in the hemodynamic signal and subtract that out from the overall so that you're sure that what you're measuring is actually cortical and not cortical plus vascular surface scalp vascular changes. So it's just a slightly more rigorous way of doing things. And to cut a long story short, what we found is that the experimental condition was a predictor of coherence. There was more coherence between mother and child. The lines here reflect the coherence between the different regions, brain regions. There's more coherence in collaboration than individual cases, as was found by the group in Vienna. So they were really happy. We replicated their work. There's nothing better than someone coming in and saying, hey, I've replicated your work. But more interestingly for us is there was no difference between the full collaboration and collaboration with screens. So it's not just eye gaze that's kind of triggering this thing. And again, as was found in Vienna, the kind of level of HBO coherence was a positive predictor of the efficacy of the dyad to solve problems. So more coherence, better at solving problems. And so the key finding from this set of studies is that the coherence persisted after reduction of physiological noise, showing that it was really driven by a kind of cerebral kind of signal. So that was just the beginning. We've actually launched into some crazy study where we're not, as I said, we're not just doing this with parent and child, but we're doing this with multiple toddlers. And so we have an ongoing study where we're looking at 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds, so there's an age dimension, collaborating together. And we're looking at also at the degree of familiarity. So they're either complete strangers, they came in with their friends, or they come in with a sibling to see whether familiarity impacts. And the preliminary analyses that we've done so far, we're about 2/3 of the way through collecting data, is it's a nightmare to do this with 3-year-olds. So don't try it. Or at least in terms of the collaboration. We knew that they don't collaborate, but they really, really don't collaborate. That familiarity doesn't seem to be playing a role initially at all, which is a little bit surprising. So that we're collecting the data, and this is moving us to our third real world type study. So watch this space. What we're planning for next year is to have actually a group of preschoolers. So 6 of them with a teacher will come in at a time, and we will be looking for synchrony, either group synchrony or dyadic synchrony, and the effectiveness, the relationship between that synchrony in 5-year-olds to kind of success on activities within both pedagogical and other activities within the preschool. So we're really moving from the basic lab to studying behaviors that will happen more naturally within the real environment. Okay, very quick. I hesitated whether I was going to put this in, but just to say that we have a bunch of PhD students also working on this. And I think I'll mention this work by Rebecca Terry because it's really quite interesting. So remember how I said 3-year-olds, it's a nightmare to do this? Well, we hired this PhD student and said, guess what? You're going to do it with 2-year-olds, just to make it even harder. Now, fortunately, she had a lot of work of experience with 2-year-olds. And we're not that cruel. We're looking at collaboration between mum and the 2-year-old, not 2-year-olds together. But it's the same sort of task. And the reason we're doing this is that there's a real kind of black hole in developmental cognitive neuroscience in this 18-month to 3-year-old age range. There's a lot of work on babies because babies are easy. They don't move that much. There's a lot of work in, say, 4-year-olds and above because they can follow instructions. It's the gap in the middle that's really hard. And our toddler lab is going to try to kind of bridge that gap. So Becky's work is right in that question mark area. And just to show you, she's found something really quite interesting. A similar task to before, except mum and child are meant to be building a house. They build it either together or separately with a curtain, and that's important, with a curtain between each other. And what she found is, after controlling for multiple comparisons and so forth, is that there was definitely greater synchrony in well, she found something surprising. There was a condition effect, but there was a condition by ROI effect, in that she found greater synchrony in the collaboration in some cases, but actually greater synchrony between some areas in the individual condition. And that's really strange because individually they're supposed to be working separately. But in fact, what we identified is that because with the 2-year-old, we had another tester in place sometimes to help out the 2-year-old if they were kind of struggling to keep on task. And what Becky found is that the presence of this second tester was predicting whether we would have synchrony, a greater synchrony between the child and mother in the individual condition or not. And you have to remember that the individual condition, what's happening is they're just separated by a curtain. And if you imagine yourself as a parent, you've come into the lab and you can hear your child struggling, which is why you are, we've had another tester coming in and you're building some uninteresting Lego thing. So I think our interpretation of this is, and is in particular, I forgot to say the synchrony was between the mum's TPJ, which is monitoring social and mental states, and the child's frontal lobe in these things. And our interpretation of this is that the mum is actually focusing more on what her child is doing, how he or she is solving the task and getting support from the other tester, rather than on this really boring build a house with Lego. Hence why her TPJ is correlating with the child's frontal lobe. Frontal lobe for the child because he's focusing on problem solving, TPJ on the mum because she's focusing on the social support aspect of it. And again, this is an example where the neuroimaging is showing us that even that the mother and child are engaging in the same task, but they're engaging in different ways, which are not necessarily obvious from just the behavioral observation. Okay, so my key point from the neuroconstructivist perspective is that, to say extreme things, is that brain function basically needs to be understood in the context of other brains as well. So what other brains are doing is impacting on how our brain is functioning as well. And finally, in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to rush through something a little bit different. So this is about taking theory, basic science to practice, into the real world practice. So I told you at the beginning that I had a dream of being a primary school teacher, and this was the beginning of my dream. But also I had your classic professional midlife crisis around 40, where I thought, I really love what I'm doing, but can I do something that has a little bit more impact? And so I decided to get involved in kind of educational research as well, and get involved in educational neuroscience. So educational neuroscience is basically saying, look, we've got all these learnings from cognitive neuroscience about learning, attention, memory. Surely there are lessons that can be translated into classroom practice. And there were some funders, the Wellcome Trust, who actually made a call for exactly that. They wanted to trial in the classroom cognitive neuroscience-based educational interventions. So we focused on the learning of counterintuitive math and science concepts. So one of the characteristics of scientific reasoning is that we're taught ideas that run counter to the lay or naive perception or ideas of the world, right? We're taught, for example, that the Earth goes around the sun, when frankly it looks like the sun is going around the Earth, right? We're taught things like, you try to teach a 7-year-old that the Earth is round, but it just looks flat, right? And you go out and play football and it's flat. So you have to overcome all these prior biases, this prior knowledge. My favorite example was from Jean Mandler, who was a concept learning person. She would always put up a picture of a dolphin and say, look, let's face it, that's a fish, right? I mean, it looks like a fish, it quacks like a fish, it is a fish, except we get told, and we know it's a mammal, but you have to kind of actively overcome all these pulsions to identify it as a fish. The other example, so it turns out that a paper came out in Mind Brain Education back in 2014, suggesting that what was a big difference between expert scientists and novice scientists was not that they did not have these lay concepts. It's not that the scientific concepts overwrite the lay concepts, which again are constantly reinforced, but rather that they were better at inhibiting the emergence of these concepts, so doing kind of the semantic interference from these concepts. And so I don't have time to show you, but basically they did some electrical tests, some tests of electrical circuits, and what they found is that when there were counterintuitive tasks, such as this one here, you have to say whether this is a valid circuit or not. If there are electrical engineers out there, they better immediately say no, because otherwise they're getting their license taken away. But basically, this is a circuit, there's a battery, this light is on, but this light is on as well, even though it's connected, but it shouldn't be on because you would need a returning wire to form a circuit, okay? But it just looks like it should be on. And so scientists, experts were kind of were engaging inhibitory control circuits. So this led us to the idea that actually one thing that might facilitate the taking up of counterintuitive concepts in school, in math and in science, would be to kind of encourage children to utilize their inhibitory control skills when reasoning about math and science. So you've got these prior beliefs, these priors, but you need to stop. So when I say something like, what do cows drink? Even over the internet, half of you who are listening will think milk, when milk is not right, it's water, right? So this is a semantic association. So you need to suppress all of this so that you can allow the correct answer, less frequent answer to come on. And the first thing we did is we ran some imaging studies, which I won't talk about, some neuroimaging studies in adolescents and children to show that the same sorts of phenomena were happening in kind of children and adults' brains as well. And then we developed an intervention, which was a simple computer game to be delivered in class to help kids learn to use their inhibitory control skills when reasoning about math and science. It's been an eye-opening road for me about how to go from rigor to something that is applicable in the classroom, that people will willingly engage in. Teachers are so busy. They're so fed up of people in white coats telling them, no, you're doing it wrong, do it this way, that they simply ignore you, right? So you need to find a way of introducing your magic ingredients in a way that's consistent with their existing practice. And so we developed a computer game, which I'll tell you, with some colleagues in EdTech at the Institute of Education at UCL. And this was then run as a large randomized control trial. We ran an initial randomized control trial with kind of 5,000 children, 84 schools. And we had the game was called Stop and Think. But we had, because we're good scientists, proper control conditions. We had a business as usual control, but we also had an active control to avoid kind of placebo effects. Another thing I learned is the people funding this, who were really smart and good intentions people, were very much against us having an active control. And they would say things like, yeah, but if you do it against business as usual, you'll maximize your chance of finding a difference. And it's like, but you're supposed to be scientists. Anyway, it's just because they have other pressures. They have policy and practical pressures. They must deliver. So that was a real, and they were smart people, but that was a real kind of learning experience for me. And then in these randomized control trials, there was a third party, independent evaluators, the NFER, who came in and evaluated children's standardized math and science performance afterwards. So we were involved in delivering, but not in assessing the thing. So again, it's to train them on using their inhibitory control skills. So it's not a computer game or a task that necessarily teaches you better inhibitory control skills, because there's a lot of prior work showing that doesn't work, but rather it's strategy training. It's teaching you, oh, I'm doing maths, I need to be utilizing my executive functions. So the class as a whole played this game for 10 weeks, 3 times a week, for 12 minutes at the beginning of a math or science lesson. But the key element was that they had to stop and think. We did it in year 3 and 5 in the UK, which is 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds. And this had to do with practical things about they're not years in which they get national evaluations, because the schools don't want you coming in and messing with their national evaluations. So there's all these other constraints that are from the real world that come into how you design this. The other thing is, so basically, it was in the form. It started in the form of a game show where there were some characters. The children were presented with a problem. What's the number? What number is shown? And here, the idea is you have to understand that it's not just 7 elements, but the 4 on the left are 10s, and this is 1s. So the answer is 43 and not 7. And just perceptually, there are 7 elements. And one of the key elements here is that there's a 5-second gap. So you cannot, this icon stop and think comes up. It doesn't allow you to respond immediately. It's just to stop all these automatic responses, and then you can fill in. And then there was a phase where the characters would explain their reason, why, and so on. And then after they got through this phase, they had a certain number of more examples like this, and we call it bonus round. And it's a bit like stickers. You go, hooray, you've made the bonus round. They go, hooray, we'll do more of those. Um, um, and we had some science problems as well. The key thing also, another real world constraint, is that ideally we would be delivering this in an individualized fashion, one person in front of the screen, so you could tune the feedback to the needs, the level of performance of the child. But again, a real world constraint. You go to the schools and you say to them, have you got 28 computers? And they say, yes, we have 28 computers. Only 26 of them work. 10 of them are from 20 years ago, 10 of them are from 10 years ago, and 5 of them are from, so it just became impossible to do it in a standardized way. So we chose to deliver it as a whole class activity. So the whole class would sit and watch this on a big projection screen and work out the problem together. And then to cut a long story short, so I'm almost finished. This is the kind of report that the funders, the Education Endowment Foundation, would produce, and they look at the effectiveness of this thing. And broadly, what we found is that for maths, combining years 3 and 5 together, there was a small effect size that the kids made an estimated progress of 1 month. Marginally significant, if not significant, progress. In science, they made 2 months progress relative to those who were not, in the trial, and a highly significant thing. And it was very cheap. It comes out to about £5 per child. And if you're a head teacher and you're thinking, wow, I spend £5 and I get 2 extra months progress on my standardized scores, that looks like really good value. So that was the efficacy trial, and then the funders wanted they're wonderful people. They gave us lots of money and they helped us, but all they ever want to do is fund other trials. They suggested a follow effectiveness trial, this time 12,000 kids, 175 schools. But for strategic or political reasons, they changed who the primary target of the intervention was. They wanted this to be an intervention on children with free school meals, so low SES kids. And the idea is they want to find something that will bridge the gap between low SES and mid SES children, which was not, we were telling them in the original trial, it had no particular effect on low SES kids. So if you're relying on evidence, don't change for the follow-up trial, but they ignored us. And basically what we found there was a complete replication of the first trial. So basically, if you separate out FSM children, there's no effect. That's what we found the first time. If you put all the kids together, they found even less, but no effect in math. But in science, we had the same 2-month progress, highly significant. So it seems effective at improving primary school kids' performance on kind of science tests and so forth. So you might think, I'm just about finished this. You might think, hooray, you've gone from basic science, from neuroimaging, to developing something that could be done in the classroom, to getting teachers to take it up, to having 2 large trials that show that it works. That's it. And unfortunately, that's not it. That's, if you're going into applied work, which I am now stepping back from, that's only the beginning. Because even though we know it works, it's getting schools to take it up. And that is not, getting teachers to say, you know what, I'm happy with the way I'm doing things. I'm not going to take this up. That's really hard. Same in clinical. You might have developed an intervention that you can prove, but getting practitioners to change their behaviors is a completely different game. And it's not one I'm going to be doing because I'm a scientist, but I'm looking for people to take this forward. And we're actually looking for partnerships with educational technology companies that could incorporate this within, one of their portfolios of educational games they would sell and support and so forth, because it has all this science proving that it works. Okay, so that's it. I'm afraid that I would have had 5 minutes left for questions if Jochen hadn't introduced me for 5 minutes. But just the final things, I've come back to my real world picture of my PhD friend in his reality TV show. But I think the lessons I want people to come away from here is really that, first of all, neuroconstructivism provides a framework for thinking about situated and embodied development in the real world. It's critical to take the child's effective learning environment seriously. That is the statistics of the environment, but also the way in which the structure of the environment changes through embodied factors, different needs and values, and the presence of other individuals in the environment as well. And the final point, bridging from theory to practice has many inherent challenges as well. So it's not easy. And I think that's it. Thank you very much. Here's some fantastic books you can buy as Christmas presents for your friends if you would like.